Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching. My name is Flyer from Africa, and today is day 28 of our challenge. So today we focus on the female gender. So we want to go to our site and really pick our content, any content creator, especially those who based in this country. And so right now it's 7 a.m. and I want to go to brush my teeth and wash my face as I take a cup of tea as we head to our side. So guys, if you haven't subscribed also to this channel, I want you to go and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And we support our homes, we support our content creators, especially those who pays in this country. So as I've already told you, we now focus on the female gender right now. So we want to edit to our side to support our own. So guys, today is between Mungai and Lengoge. Let's even put Mungai. So today is a Mungai, and let's go subscribe to Mungai. Right now is at 600,000 subscribers. Let's reach him. Let's hit him even to 1 million. Let's reach 1 million subscribers before the end of this year. We're gonna do it, man. So let's support our own. If you support people, God can bless you in another way. And if you subscribe to their channel, there is no any deduction. If you subscribe to YouTube, any YouTube channel, there is no any deduction on it. You know, some people say when I subscribe, it's like you're going to be deducted. There is no any deduction on it. So go subscribe to the YouTube channel to Mungai. Mungai is a content creator based in this country. Is an interviewer. He normally interviews people. Is an interviewer, and so let's go support her as we edit to our site. So right now, let me just go wash my face and also brush my teeth as we edit to our site. I love you all, including every pie. Let's meet there. Let's meet on our site, guys. So right now, brushing my teeth as we edit to our site. Guys, let's edit there. We're gonna do it. So anytime I wake up, first, you brush your teeth, get a cup of water, as you get a cup of tea. So anytime I work out, I must drink a cup of water. So as you can see, it's like 1.5. So guys, we are on our side. So today we are on the female gender, right? So today we want to go and subscribe to Mungai channel. So as I've already told you that Mungai based in Kenya, and Mungai is a content creator. He's an interviewer, in other words, right? So Mungai is at 600,000 subscribers right now. Let's add him to 1 million before the end of this year. We're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. Let's support our own. Let's go. 3, 2, 1. Subscribe to Mungai. 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 Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai. 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 Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel. So don't worry, guys. I'm in the middle of tea plantation. As you can see over there. Let's go with our challenge. Subscribe to Mungai. 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 Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe. Let's support our own. 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 Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. 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 Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe. Let's aid him 1 million. Let's hit him 1 million before the end of this year, right? Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel.
So subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. So we must go have to hub there. I don't know if you can see it. But let's go. Subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai, subscribe. Go and subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai, subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go, subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel, subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. 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 Go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel. 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 Go and subscribe. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. 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 Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe to Mungai channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe. Let's go subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to Eve channel. Subscribe to Eve channel. Subscribe to Eve channel. Subscribe to Eve channel. Subscribe to mungai. Subscribe to mungai. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai. Subscribe to mungai. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. 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 Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to Eve channel. Subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go and subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go and scroll. Subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Go and subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai Eve channel. Let's go and 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 subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go and subscribe to Eve channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Let's go and subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to mungai channel. Subscribe to mungai channel. I love you all. Let's meet in the next video. I love you all, including everybody. Bye for now.